Hi everyone, welcome to the History Respawn podcast. I'm your host Bob Whitaker. On this episode, I'll be talking to a pair of historians who served as historical advisors on the most recent version of the Oregon Trail game, published last year by developer Gameloft and available on Apple Arcade. Released around the 50th anniversary of the introduction of the Oregon Trail in Minneapolis, Gameloft's version of the game is advertised as the most historically accurate version of Oregon Trail to date, and a version, in the words of the developers, that features respectful representations of Indigenous Americans. This desire for historical accuracy and better representation led Gameloft to reach out to a group of Indigenous scholars to help with the development process, including our guest on today's episode. First, we have Dr. Margaret Huettl, who is an assistant professor of history and ethnic studies at the University of Nebraska. Margaret is a scholar of Native American history and North American West, and her research examines Indigenous sovereignty and settler colonialism in a transnational context. Margaret, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Nice to have you. And next we have Dr. Katie Phillips, who's an assistant professor of American Indian history at Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota. Katie's research focuses on Ojibwe activism, environmentalism, and tourism. Katie, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, Margaret, Katie, just off the top, what kind of experience did y'all have with the Oregon Trail prior to this project?
So, Margaret and I, we've known each other for a while, and I think for both of us, it was honestly growing up playing the game. You know, we are part of that generation, right? We're called, one of the names for us is the Oregon Trail generation.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was honestly really fascinating to kind of go from being, kids playing the game to then being grown-up historians, having a chance to, revise it and revamp it.
Yeah, I think it's the first game that I remember playing on a computer, my first interaction with that kind of technology. And so, to look back on it all of these years later, the nostalgia mixed with obviously the more critical perspectives of an Indigenous historian now.
Yeah. I study the Oregon Trail as a research project, and one of the things I always get from older scholars is this kind of indifference or outright hostility to the idea of studying games as a potential vehicle for historical knowledge or, historical memory. And I'm like, look, everybody in my age group, I'm in my late 30s, just played Oregon Trail. Either we were forced to or we did it for fun. So, so I'm right in the same boat as y'all. So how did y'all come to work on this project?
So we actually got involved with the project through kind of the Newberry Library, which has a research relationship with Houghton Mifflin, the publisher that initially owned the rights to the game. And the game developers really wanted to do something different with this game and do better than had been done in the past. So they reached out through the Newberry Library to pull together a group of historians, not just on Native American history, but the American West, African American history more generally. And it started with a Zoom conversation because this was back at the beginning of the pandemic, right, Katie?
Time has lost all sense of meaning, but that sounds about right. We were definitely on Zoom. I know that much.
Yes, we were definitely on Zoom. And one of the first things they asked us was, can this even be done? Can we include Indigenous people in this game in a meaningful, not tokenizing way? Which was a great question to hear from the start because it showed they were thinking about how to do this. Not just for entertainment value, but also for educational value as well.
And it was honestly, it felt like there was kind of a lot of pressure, not externally, right? It wasn't coming from the developers or anything like that, but Oregon Trail is kind of iconic. And to one, right, to even be asked to update something that has such a hold on so many people was a little nerve-wracking. And then being asked, how do we pull in Indigenous history, right? How do we pull in all of these other histories into this game, right? Because you rarely find folks that are going to play Oregon Trail for the educational value, right? And so a lot of it was pulling on a lot of our, teaching tricks and thinking about, how can we present this information in a way that's going to be correct, that's going to be educational, while also maintaining the entertainment factor, which is the main draw for the game in the first place.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, and I don't know if you've played the game, and this is similar to the original game as well. There are very few words, which, as a historian who likes to use a lot of words, is very difficult because you're trying to get complex historical events and traumas and all of these things across in like the tiniest snippets of dialogue.
I would say, as a historian, I completely agree. But at the same time, as somebody who's getting on in age and has a little bit of difficulty reading text on their phone, I do kind of appreciate the fact that there's not as much text in this game as there could potentially be in like a desktop version, for instance. So, but that's just me. I don't know. So did y'all have any experience with working on projects like this, either a game or a TV show or documentary or a film or anything like that before?
This was the first time I'd gotten to do anything like this. I am admittedly not a gamer. I like Oregon Trail. I grew up in northern Wisconsin, so we had like Big Buck Hunter, but that was kind of the extent of my interaction with those. And so, I've done a couple other, media related things, but a video game was definitely a new experience.
For me as well. I haven't done anything else like this. Probably the most fun I've had as a historian, though. Like, I'm just thinking of your work in a completely different context. It's exciting, and it's fun to play around a little bit with history.
Awesome. So how was the working experience with the developers? And, I think for our academic audience for the show, I think they'd be curious to know, did the game developers come to you with a certain set of ideas in place and they were looking for fact checking, or were they looking for you to help to provide some historical nuggets, some information that maybe they weren't aware of? Were they coming, kind of as a blank slate, in other words?
I think the answer is both. They had some ideas already developing, and then they also had they also were asking us for ideas of historical figures to potentially incorporate. And I mean, I'm pretty sure, I can't remember, Katie, was it them or Willie Bauer, who was the other Indigenous historian working on the game with us, who found Black Beaver, the Lenape character who you follow through a lot of the game?
I can't remember, but it was definitely a great experience because one of the things that always stood out to me was they always referred to us as the experts. And it was the first time they said it, I was like, oh God, no, like I'm not an expert. But it was but they trusted us, right? And it sounds kind of corny to say, like, they trusted us. They believed us when we would say, this might not be the best take for this. What if we do this instead? And Gameloft is based in Australia. And so aside from all of the logistical challenges of getting people, I think we were in like 4 or 5 time zones to actually find a time to get us all on a call together. But they were pretty open about, the limitations of their knowledge, right, of the American West and things like that. And so they really did trust us. And, Margaret and I have talked about this before, but one of my favorite moments in working on this was, they showed us kind of this mock-up of, one of the layouts of the game. And Margaret was like, "Oh, I love that you have, all of this detail and all of this, but here's one tiny little thing that needs to change." I think it was like the blanket designs.
Yeah, the color of the blankets. Yeah, was that kind of like new agey southwestern color instead of the, colors it would have been. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like, with Margaret, what you said about having less opportunity to use text, that, kind of the history of material culture would be really important to, and maybe really useful too. I mean, it is a game, it is a visual medium. So, having those kinds of material aspects and having them depicted accurately, I think would be, I'm sure was a big part of the work on this.
Yeah, and another part of that was music too, because I don't know if you, a lot of people play, phone is constantly silent, never makes any noise, right? But if you play it with the sound on, they do have music. And one of the conversations that we had that I feel like was one of the more difficult conversations, although in the end, it's one of those examples where they really respected our opinion, was there was just so much flute music, like the stereotypical emerging from the mist flute music trilling in the background, and they had genuinely tried to find Indigenous artists that they could sample, and they did actually switch from one. They had found samples of music that were from someone who claimed to be Indigenous but like was not actually Indigenous, and they took those sounds out after we pointed that out. And Katie really tried to explain why the flute music is problematic and has certain stereotypes associated with it. And they toned down the flute, and that's another example of how they incorporated our feedback on little details that I think in the end do make a difference.
That's excellent. I do play the game with sound on. I've got a nice pair of AirPod Pros that I got for Christmas, and I use it when I put my 3-year-old to bed, actually. And so he's there in bed, and I'm sitting there with my phone playing this and some other games. And, I think it's so true with what you say about flute music. I think I had read, I think it was a review that Philip Deloria had written about the music in Last of the Mohicans. It's a very famous period piece movie done by Michael Mann and Daniel Day-Lewis in, I think it was 91, 92, something like that. And that has just got this rousing, very influential flute-based score. And I would bet that a lot of game developers and, film producers kind of look at that as like, oh, this is when we're doing one of these stories, this is the type of music that we have to use.
Yeah, and what was really interesting about that conversation is we had to be like, all right, it's not as like in your face as the drum, right? It wasn't like the dun 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 when it's like, you watch Stagecoach and you're like, oh God, that means the Indians are coming. But it was still, we heard that flute, and I think we both just kind of had almost like a visceral reaction to it.
Yes.
And it was very much, I think we both kind of had to step back and be like, okay, if we think about this historically, what is the best way to kind of get this across? And we actually went back to Phil Deloria's book, Indians in Unexpected Places, because he has a whole chapter on music, right? And it's one of those things that you don't really think about, right? You're not supposed to think about the music behind the game, but it has such an enormous influence on how you interpret something. And so, and like Margaret said, they were great about it because we were like, we are well aware that this is like the most nitpicky we have been throughout this entire process. But it can't be there, right? Like we've done all of this work. You guys have done just an incredible job putting this together. And if we have that new agey flute trilling thing, I love Margaret's analogy of like emerging from the mist.
That was great. I love that. Yeah.
Like the minute we put that in there, we're going to lose so much of that work that we've done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, I tell people all the time with looking at historical games is that they're different from historical films. They're different from maybe a museum display, a public history project that's just got text, because with historical games, you've got to worry about text. You've got to worry about appearance. You've also got to worry about sound, and all of that together at the same time. And so it's like it multiplies the ways in which a historical game can really, excuse my language, F things up really, really badly. It's just like there's many more possibilities to screw up than there are for maybe a film or a TV show or, public history display that's text-based. So, yeah.
Oh, yes. One of the little details that really just kind of hit me when we were seeing some of the mock-ups was the prairie. They do such a good job of capturing the landscape of the prairie and the sunsets and the different kinds of native grasses and everything. That's one of those places where they're really using all of the tools available to try to really situate the players in this environment.
So do y'all think that this is the type of work that you would be interested in doing again? And I guess I'll go with Katie this time.
I'd love to. It was a lot of fun to get to use, this knowledge, this education kind of outside the classroom, and to think about the range of a game like this. And, it was when we got to see, when we got towards the end and we got to see, they would almost kind of like play it for us a little bit. And this sounds really ridiculous, but it was like almost made me a little bit emotional, because it was like, like we said at the beginning, this was such a key facet of our lives growing up. And then to have had the opportunity to have an impact on something like this was like, it was phenomenal. It was, honestly, it's one of the coolest things I've ever gotten to do.
Yeah, and we helped to write they have an acknowledgement that kind of directly confronts the history of dispossession, because this is still a game about settling the West. And that, that core element has not changed. And so to acknowledge that for Indigenous peoples, this history was one of violence and dispossession, but also survivance. And more people are going to read those words that I helped to write than pretty much anything else. I can guarantee than anything else.
You're still early on. You might write something else. You'll get there. But it's true. I mean, you think about the reach of these games, particularly mobile games, which have such a greater audience than even things that appear on a desktop computer or a video game console. Many more people play these types of games. And, particularly because this is a game that is available through what they call Apple Arcade, which is kind of a Netflix model for mobile games. And so, if you pay, I think it's $5 a month, you can gain access to this and play it an unlimited amount of time. And it does have, with this game, I think there are some of the mobile game conventions, particularly with kind of this idea of energy use and game mechanics that are built to try to encourage you to spend money as much as possible. But, I think at the same time, to have it as part of a subscription service through Apple, which is kind of the be-all, end-all of, mobile platforms, I think that's really great. Yeah, really wide audience, and hopefully one that's not just limited to North America.
Yeah, and honestly, we were once we found out, oh my God, like the game's been released, what's going to happen? I don't know about you, Margaret, but I was just like frantically refreshing my Twitter feed to be like, oh, what are people going to say? Because again, right, like it was a huge undertaking, but like one of the first things we saw was someone who mentioned the acknowledgement at the beginning. Right. And, like Margaret said, this is still a game that celebrates settler colonialism, manifest destiny, like that conquering of the West and things like that. But for that to have an effect on people and for people to stop and be like, they really took the time, to add this at the beginning. That was one of the first things I saw about it. And it was really awesome to see that people were recognizing that it's not just black and white. There are a lot of nuances, and what does it mean to revamp this game in a way that is still bringing Native people into it. Mm-hmm. So that part was really cool, was once we started to see the response and the reaction to it.
So I guess along those lines, do you think this is the type of work that you would share with students? I mean, is it the type of thing that maybe you would let students know that you had worked on, but also would you encourage students to maybe try this game out in a classroom setting or otherwise?
Yeah, I teach classes on the US West, and I've always used the original Oregon Trail, which you can play in some places online, and they have like card games and everything. And we always, that's one of the things that I like to use because it's something that students relate to, and you can have fun engaging with it in class. And so I think pairing this game with the original game, and then also with games that were made by Indigenous game makers, like When Rivers Were Trails, which is a game that you can play for free online, I think, by an Ojibwe an Ojibwe game maker. If you pair them together and look at the many different ways that we tell these stories about the West and our shared past and American expansion and how we got where we are today, who we are today, I think that it's so good for students to see that there are multiple narratives that exist about the same historical event.
And, clearly, Margaret and I have a lot of similar teaching interests and research interests. And I've used this in my class on the American West. I used it in my class on Native Americans and popular culture. And again, to pair it with When Rivers Were Trails, and to have, there's a great NPR article that Margaret was quoted in when the game came out, and to have our students really look critically at these multiple different things that are out there, and just to see how they work together.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I'm really encouraged to hear that y'all, use this and use the older game too in the classroom. I think like Margaret, I use the older version of Oregon Trail as well as a way to get students to understand, how long a legacy this kind of material has and how many different ways, not just from textbooks, but from movies and games, where we get historical memory, historical ideas. And I think too with the Oregon Trail, it's an easy kind of softball pitch to a lot of students because, I have them play the game as a group. They argue amongst each other about when to ford a river, how much supplies to get, and all of this. And then at the end of all that, I'm like, okay, what is this story missing, right? What is missing from this 1985 version of this game, which has had a huge influence on everybody. And so obviously they bring up things like the Indigenous perspective, but then also, there's no mention of the slave trade or the importance of slavery to westward expansion, all these things. So I think they're useful tools, even if the history in them are, incomplete and sometimes very bad. So yeah, I think that's great. But at least with this newer version, we've got historians like yourselves working on it. So that's really encouraging for me. I'm really excited that you all did this, and I'm glad to hear it was such a good experience.
It's just really exciting to see that the reach that this new game has, and that it's, people are coming back to it. And we are quite literally the target market for the revamp, right? We're the generation that played it originally. It's like now they have minivan commercials that play the songs we used to dance to in clubs. It's like, this is that version of it. Right. And so, yeah, just, to have people come back to it, while there are also people who are finding it for the first time. So.
Okay, I think that's all the time we have for this episode of History Respawn. Margaret, Katie, thank you so much for joining me on this episode.
You're welcome, and thank you.
Yeah, thanks. It was great to be here.
And thank you, listener, for tuning in to this episode of History Respawned. If you enjoy our work, please visit our website at historyrespawned.com. And if you really appreciate our work, please consider supporting the show on Patreon at patreon.com/History Respawned. And until next time, goodbye.